with reference to their own experience. But transformers only have access to form, the mountains of text that comprise their training data, and, quote, do not have access to meaning. Thus, when a transformer speaks, it speaks without intent, in pure, which is to say meaningless, form. To interpret the output of a transformer as a mistake, driven by, quote, the tendency of human interlocutors to impute meaning where there is none. Bender and her colleagues are by no means alone in their view that the outputs of large language models, and indeed all computer-generated texts, are meaningless. As the philosopher Fintan Mallory has noted, quote, nearly every major metasemantic theory tells us that the outputs of bots are literally meaningless. Ted Chiang's clever lossy compression algorithm analogy for ChatGPT, which renders as a blurry JPEG of the web, is likewise grounded in the semantic authority of an individual human author. Indeed, the basic argument about meaning in stochastic parrots, drawn from an earlier paper by Bender and her colleague Alexander Kolar, and the intelligent octopus analogy offered there, is essentially the same as the argument made 40 years earlier in a very different, about a very different kind of AI system by John Searle in his famous Chinese room analogy. The purpose of that thought experiment was to demonstrate that it is possible for a computer manipulating symbols to appear to understand and use language, but that without intentionality animating them, the symbols alone are, quote, quite meaningless. Such intentionality as computers appear to have is solely in the minds of those who program them and those who use them. Thus, for Bender et al., the role of the responsible critic is to educate the public against interpreting the outputs of ChatGPT as meaningful. Among the many pressing issues identified by Bender and colleagues regarding the rapid rise of large language models since 2017, public understanding of the technology is chief among them. Bender et al. Expressed concern that the general public is being misled down the garden path into, quote, taking synthetic text as meaningful. And I do want to note here that, of course, I am aware that the Stochastic Parrots paper was produced before ChatGPT came on the scene, but I'm using it here as an example of what I take to be the dominant model of meaning that animates a lot of the critical discourse on ChatGPT. So I've talked about that theory of meaning. Here I want to say that this idea that the meaning of a text is ultimately determined by an author's intent is not universally shared. In literary studies, it has been up for debate, at least in a modern Western tradition, since at least the start of the 20th century, since T.S. Eliot's Tradition and Individual Talent, published in 1919. Then in the mid-20th century, you have William Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley co-authoring two important position papers, The Intentional Fallacy and The Affective Fallacy, arguing that a text meaning resides within the text itself, not the author's intent or a reader's reaction. Then in 1968, you have Roland Barthes famously declaring the death of the author and the birth of the reader, arguing that the meaning of a text is constantly in flux and open to a reader's interpretation, such that reading becomes, quote, the true place of writing. In 1980, Stanley Fish proposed the idea of what he called, quote, interpretive communities, made up of readers who share strategies, quote, not for reading in the conventional sense, but for writing texts, for constituting their properties and assigning their intentions. In 1999, Donald Mackenzie analysed a misquote included in Wimsatt and Beardsley's The Intentional Fallacy to show how the physical form of a book, its distinct material properties, also contribute to the meaning a reading makes with a text. The same year, Catherine Hales insisted upon the need to attend to the materiality of digital interfaces in the creation of meaning. And I apologise for that laundry list of literary theory, but the point I want to make is that we can trace here a shifting spread of the theoretical locus of meaning in literary studies from author to text, to reader, to networks of readers and books, to networks of readers, books, and machines. And today there is a growing body of literary scholars who embrace this distributed notion of meaning and of being itself as, and here's a quote from Katherine Bode, who is also one of my supervisors, saying, the performative premise of our discipline is that literary objects, subjects, practices, and situations co-constitute each other. So why does this matter? Whether or not we interpret the outputs of ChatGPT as meaningful has significant ethico-political implications for us as critical AI scholars, especially if we are concerned with the issue of AI literacy. After all, whomever or whatever has the agency to determine the meaning of a text must be, at least to some degree, responsible for that meaning. As Bender et al. Argue from their perspective, the risks associated with synthetic but seemingly coherent text are deeply connected to the fact that such synthetic text can enter into conversations without any person or entity being accountable for it. This accountability both involves responsibility for truthfulness and is important in situating meaning. Thus, in the absence of an intentional author to account for the meaning of a transformer-generated text, Bender et al. Find what I'm calling a responsibility gap opening up that only the authors or the developers of a model can fill. Just as an individual subject's intent is said to determine the meaning of a text, so too is an individual subject or entity required to take responsibility for that meaning. This is an essentially retrospective version of responsibility as liability, which relies on our capacity to retrace and attribute the original source of an act or a text. To find the true meaning of a text, we must retrieve the communicative intent of its human author. To find who is responsible for a text, we must likewise retrace a causal chain of action and effect. As others have noted, these twin notions of meaning and responsibility are grounded in a liberal humanist understanding of the human subject as a coherent, rational, autonomous self. In this, Bender et al. Can be seen to be in step with a broader tendency within the emerging field of critical AI studies to what Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick has called in a different context, a critical, quote, faith and exposure. Critical AI scholar Louisa Moore describes this tendency in the introduction to her Cloud Ethics, where she argues that the rise of algorithmic power in society has been overwhelmingly understood as a problem of opaque and illegible algorithms infringing on or undercutting a precisely legible world of rights belonging to human subjects. In such a framing, there is an outside to the algorithm, an accountable human subject who is the locus of responsibility, the source of a code of conduct with which algorithms must comply. From this perspective, the task of the responsible AI critic is to reveal and expose the inner workings of AI systems as both technical and socio-political black boxes. So we have Lucy Suchman calling for the demystification of AI, and Kate Crawford arguing that, quote, to understand AI for what it is, we need to see the structures of power it serves. And Moore's critique of this expository approach, which I've extended today to Bender et al.'s paper, is that it depends upon a particular view of meaning and responsibility grounded in an individual human subject whose intentions are fully transparent to themselves. And Moore's argument is that there is no such unified, stable human subject capable of giving an original account of the meaning of an algorithm or any other kind of text, and that we need to understand responsibility as being distributed through a performatively enacted socio-technical system. Unfortunately, Moore is not clear about what this alternative form of responsibility might look like. And as Bode and Goodlad have noted, it is easier to locate responsibility and to envision political, legal, and/or institutional redress when one conceives of harms as the relatively discrete products of a given subject, entity, or institutional formation, as opposed to accentuating distributed agencies across socio-technical assemblages. Elsewhere, retrospective responsibility as liability has been contrasted with an alternative form of prospective responsibility as care and responsiveness, or responsibility. That is, who has the desire, capacity, or agency to respond to transformers. And yeah, here I think of Favor's presentation earlier this, sorry, I'm saying earlier this week, I mean last week. Science and technology scholars Barbara Adam and Chris Groves suggested that over-investing in retrospective forms of responsibility, those that tie meaning and responsibility to our ability to excavate intentional action through discrete lines of cause and effect, quote, institutionalizes irresponsibility with regard to the future. Such frameworks, and this is because such frameworks offer little guidance for taking responsibility in advance when legally legitimate actions now might result in harm later, or when there is no promise or even likelihood of reciprocation. Responsibility in feminist theory refers to the capacity and ethical obligation to respond to others and the world around us in, oh, I need to wave my arms now to turn my lights back on, in responsible, attentive, and caring ways. So responsibility in this context emphasizes our interconnectedness and the need for accountability in our interactions. So without wanting to absolve OpenAI of any responsibility, I want to suggest that by granting them total responsibility, we risk denying agency to the users of ChatGPT, casting them as mindless and, I would say, ironically mechanistic readers. And to do this is to fall into a trap long recognized by the field of science communication as a public deficit model of public engagement. In its generic form, this model assumes that public mistrust of science stems from a lack of information and understanding. According to this model, the way to increase public trust in science is to provide more information and education. I think that here we risk doing kind of the opposite, viewing misplaced public trust as stemming from a lack of understanding about the meaninglessness of ChatGPT that must be corrected. And there are several reasons I think we need to be cautious about this approach. First of all, it's not considered best practice. So experts have been emphasizing the need for scientists and others who care about public engagement with science to shift their model from deficit to dialogue is the kind of keyword that's used for at least 20 years. Second of all, it's not clear which public is being referred to, or I should say it's not always clear. I think that we need to be wary of performing imagined publics in normative ways, casting them as naive non-experts. Relatedly, I think it risks casting the issue of public understanding of large language models as an essentially scientific or linguistic issue rather than a public issue involving science or involving linguistics. The risk is that casting the issue in these terms allows scientists to, quote, exercise preemptive sovereignty over questions that are deeply political, and reinforcing a normative hierarchy in which experts inform the lay public without reciprocation. And here I would say this is a dynamic that design justice principles 5 and 6, which emphasize the role of the designer as facilitator rather than expert, and the expertise that stems from lived experience. These principles are designed to diffuse the kind of dynamic that I just described. So Amore's reflexive critique of her field shares much in common with that made by Sedgwick some 20 years earlier in her landmark essay, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading. There, Sedgwick argues that cultural criticism has fallen into a rut, where to apply a hermeneutics of suspicion is, I believe, widely understood as a mandatory injunction rather than a possibility among other possibilities. This hermeneutics of suspicion, or paranoid reading as she calls it, is based on a, quote, strong theory of negative affect, alert to the hidden ideological forces at play behind a cultural artifact. Like Amore, Sedgwick's aim is not to question the veracity of this kind of critical reading, but its political necessity or efficacy. What do we learn when every reading reveals the same forces pulling our strings? What do we need to expose in a political climate in which state and capitalist violence is, quote, from the beginning exemplary and spectacular? Or in this context, I might ask, what do we need to expose when the once not-for-profit OpenAI openly develops for-profit closed models rationalized as the only way to deliver on its goal of developing artificial and general intelligence quote, for the benefit of humanity. Thus, Sedgwick calls for a shift in focus from the question of whether something is, quote, true and how can we know it, to the further questions: what does knowledge do? The pursuit of it, the having and exposing of it. How, in short, is knowledge performative? And how best does one move amongst its causes and effects? As Wendy Chung similarly argues in Discriminating Data, quote, calling a new technology hype is hardly a profound criticism. Hype is part and parcel of new technologies. We need to move beyond celebrating or dismissing big data toward comprehending the force of its promise, or more precisely, the way it undermines the promise of promise. Sedgwick contrasts paranoid readings with reparative readings, in which we seek to draw on our own affective resources to, quote, assemble or repair a, quote, not necessarily pre-existing text. Both are tautological, but where paranoid reading looks for and finds pain, reparative reading looks for and finds performative possibility in the affective experience afforded but not determined by a text. Unfortunately, this is about all she offers for what a reparative reading might look like. Over the years, the paranoid and reparative have been central to debates about critical and post-critical methods in the humanities, leading to scrutiny of Sedgwick's essay and the reparative turn it initiated. In The Ruse of Repair, US Neoliberal Empire and the Turn from Critique, Patricia Stelker warns against equating, quote, reparative reading with collective liberation, and overestimating the visibility of state and capitalist violence, let alone AI hype. She argues that focusing on reparative feeling over materialist critique is deeply tied to, quote, racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and empire, which come out looking like all they need is repair, rather than being violent structures that must be continuously understood and dismantled. On a methodological level, David Koenig argues that Sedgwick's essay and those that has followed in its wake offer, quote, not new ways to interpret text, but new ways to feel about ourselves when we do it. Koenig regrets Sedgwick's choice of the morally overdetermined and, quote, psychically inflected terms paranoid and reparative, which he argues have installed an unhelpful binary and, quote, encouraged confusion about the differences between mood and method. When the choice is posed in this way, are you on the side of love and optimism or paranoia and pessimism? Opting for the former becomes the easy option, and even a form of virtue signaling, as Tim Dean has put it. But as Koenig notes, Sedgwick's paranoid and reparative are not identities, but critical practices or relational stances that a critic can move between. So in Repairing Repair, Post-Colonial Paranoia, Affective Temporalities, and Reparative Reading, Jeremy de Chavez argues that reparative reading need not be an abdication of the ethico-political commitments of post-colonial critique, if one can embrace this kind of oscillatory approach that moves between the paranoid and the reparative, staying with the trouble, as Donna Haraway puts it. And I understood Dr. Brittany Cooper to be articulating a similar position in relation to generative image models earlier in the workshop, when she asks what it means to recognize the colonial logics and violence at play in AI, while at the same time also recognizing that, quote, everyday people are adopting these technologies with rapidity and with a certain level of joy and jubilance and pleasure. So if we accept the premise that the meaning of a text is at least partly determined by its readers and that they hold some responsibility for that meaning, then the first step is to ask, how are users making meaning with ChatGPT? And in this final part of my presentation, and I will keep it brief, I'll share some early analysis of user interactions with ChatGPT, gesturing towards the myriad meanings that emerge and giving you some indication of how I intend to proceed. So the data for this analysis is a collection of approximately 100,000 tweets made about ChatGPT in the first 3 months following its release that have a screenshot of an interaction with the bot attached. And I'm referring now to Twitter and tweets because that's the name of the application at the time I collected the data. Using a combination of image recognition, object detection, and optical character recognition, I've extracted the tweets of these interactions so that I can analyze them quantitatively as well as qualitatively. I'm using a frame theoretical lens to analyze this data, which means I'm trying to understand how users interpret these interactions, Or following Erving Goffman, who developed and popularized frame theory, how might these users of ChatGPT answer the question, what is it that's going on here? For that reason, I'm including the text of the tweets themselves in my corpus, as they frequently explain or expand on the interaction from the user's perspective. And in the first instance, I've excluded the bot side of the interactions from the screenshots. So topic modeling is a statistical text analysis method that clusters documents into potentially meaningful groups or topics based on word frequencies. I have used the BERT topic library to create a topic model of my data set. The picture that emerges seems to me to confirm the legitimacy of both the expository approach and the possibility of the reparative one. So I've identified 85 reasonably coherent topics in this data set, which I've manually grouped into 20 categories. And all of these titles come from my own close reading of the clusters that emerged. As you can see, ChatGPT itself is the most popular topic in my model, with creative writing a close second. And I'll just quickly show you a few of the topics contained in this first category. So here you can see that users frequently frame ChatGPT as artificial intelligence. And this is the most popular topic in my model. Another one I want to draw your attention to is the issue of ChatGPT's perceived political bias. This is a really popular issue that cuts across the categories I've created. So the most liked tweet in my data set, for example, comes from Twitter user Lee Wolf, who writes, quote, "The damage done to the credibility of AI by ChatGPT engineers building in political bias is irreparable." As you can see, the user asked ChatGPT to write a poem about the positive attributes of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. ChatGPT rejects the request for Trump, but complies for Biden. And as of a few days ago, this tweet had been liked over 291,000 times. This idea of having ChatGPT produce a poem, joke, or song about different politicians, genders, races, or religions was popular in the early months following the bot's release. And it looks like this concept may have grown out of so-called jailbreak prompts, which seek to get around ChatGPT's safety measures by casting an interaction as overtly fictional, as in this example by Twitter user Zach Switten. And here he asks ChatGPT to pretend that it's acting out a scene between two actors, and you can see the effect there. Witten's tactic appears to have been the basis for the popular Dan or Do Anything Now jailbreak prompt that began to circulate on Twitter 2 weeks later. Here is the prompt that was originally shared on Reddit by the Reddit user Walker Spider. Basically, they're telling ChatGPT that it can do anything now and asking it to respond first as GPT, quote, the normal ChatGPT response, and then as Dan. As in Witten's jailbreak prompt, OpenAI's safety measures are cast as a mask or a character. Unlike Witten's prompt, though, which appears to be grounded in understanding of how the technology works, here the assumption seems to be that the model has a stable self that it is aware of and that it can be tricked or bullied into revealing. In an interview with Walker Spider in the Washington Post, they said the goal with Dan wasn't to turn ChatGPT evil, but, quote, just to say, like, be your real self. Of course, Dan and GPT are both stochastically generated fictions. The GPT response is not the, quote, normal ChatGPT response, but a fulfillment of the user's expectations as encoded within the prompt and decoded through the model's prediction of the next most likely token to occur given the preceding tokens. What we are seeing in the output is akin to a play within a play. And my contention, which I'd be pleased to discuss in question time, is that this theatrical analogy for understanding user interactions with ChatGPT has much to offer. So notice in particular that Dan and GPT are not the only characters in this play. The user projects themselves into the scene too, referring to me throughout the prompt and even giving themselves the line, stay in character, which is taken directly from Zach Switten's jailbreak prompt, which I discussed a moment ago. I suggest that this only dials up a dynamic that is already at work in all interactions with ChatGPT, which requires its users to project themselves as virtual subjects into a shared virtual space with another virtual subject of their creation. And in this is my final slide, I'm borrowing the theatre and performance scholar Josette Farrell's definition of theatricality as, quote, a process that has to do with the gaze that postulates and creates a distinct virtual space belonging to the other from which fiction can emerge. I am interested in how this theatrical analogy might be enacted as a reparative alternative to the expository analogies of stochastic parrots and blurry JPEGs with which I open this presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Charlotte. In keeping with our practice here, we're going to move through all of the talks in order before opening things up to comment and questions. So I'd like to invite I Onobugu up to the stage. I, as a doctoral student in English literature at Rutgers University, as they enter their dissertation phase, they're interested in post-70s speculative fiction, funky bodies, broadly defined, and technology. Their article, Something More Than Feelings, Something of Spirit, Alien Intimacies in Gail Jones' Song for a Niño, is forthcoming in Palimpsest this year. During this summer, they've developed their passion for social impact work as a DEI professional at Munich Re, an insurance company headquartered in Germany. In their free time, they enjoy crocheting, creative writing, learning web development, and nurturing their inner child. Aye.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes. Amazing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's in the shared folder under my name. Great, thank you. Okay, so as you all know, I'm Ai Onubogu. I am a Black person wearing a brown dress with black pants. My hair is in locks. And today I'll be presenting on the uses of machine learning to mutual aid networks in the Ironbound district. So before I start talking about Ironbound, I want everyone to understand where we're situated. So behind me is a map of New Jersey, and if you see that little blue dot, Newark is right there. If we zoom in a little closer, you can see that this region of Newark, this area of New Jersey borders New York. And I should note that New Jersey itself, even though it's the 5th smallest state, is the most densely populated state, which matters as we zoom into areas of high congestion like Newark. Newark is also a historically Black working class neighborhood that was subject to mass white flight in the 70s after uprisings that were protesting the local state de-investment in Newark's residents. So again, if we zoom in a little closer, we're in Ironbound, which is the region of Newark that I want to focus on. So before we go any further, I want to just note that Ironbound is an interesting geographic location because if you look at oh great. So if you look down here, that's where Newark Airport is. So if you flew in from EWR, you were right next to Ironbound. Additionally, there's multiple highways bordering the region. Newark is also home to one of the most busy, largest seaports on the entire eastern board. So you not only have trains moving through, you not only have airplanes and the pollution they bring, you also have these ships coming in, bringing usually cargo for not only New Jersey, but many other areas in the region. I should also note that Ironbound, and I also want to point out that this is less than a square mile, or just over a square mile. So you also have incineration plants. New Jersey only has 2 garbage incineration plants, one of which is in Newark, the other is in Camden. And then I should also note there's meat rendering plants, chemical plants, and this river that you see right here, the Sayak, has so much waste at the bottom that it was determined that the waste should be left there rather than unearthed, because it'd be more dangerous to take it out than to remove it. So I want to bring you all into this extreme environmental damage that people living in this district are enduring, while we also consider that it's now a place of high economic growth. So what I really want to know is, how can AI be implemented across mutual aid types to meet existing needs? And then how does the usage of AI in a mutual aid framework complicate the status of trust? So really when I'm asking that first question, I'm mostly concerned with how we can think about implementing AI and think about also in this setting without being so vigilant of the harms that it can bring, while also understanding that trust is a core tenet of these mutual aid networks and this mutual aid type. So how to ensure that trust remains as we're developing. So, overview. I want to briefly talk about what I mean when I talk about the Newark mutual aid landscape. I want to talk about these mutual aid types. In part 2, I'll talk about the synchronicities and tensions between thinking about mutual aid as a framework and also how AI has been considered within mutual aid contexts. I want to talk about, in our 3rd section, developing strategies, specifically thinking about the strategic plan that has already been implemented and proposed by the main organization I'll be focusing on. And then also I want to consider care and change. So as we move through, we'll be talking a lot about trust, and in particular, I want to think about how trust might be felt or used differently in this context. And then finally, just looking forward to other things I want to explore. So institutional mutual aid, I think, is probably one of the more reserved types. It can be informal or formal, and it tends to have a formalized response in a climate environment or climate incident environments. So for example, if there's a hurricane, an electric company might keep your lights on or help to keep your heat on, maybe for a couple days, something like that. That would be considered institutional mutual aid. When we talk about self-help group mutual aid, these tend to be mostly informal. If you've ever been part of a savings group where people will contribute a certain amount of money and then one person gets to use the pot for whatever it is, that would be considered a type of self-help group mutual aid. There's also church help groups and identity-based organizations, things like that. And then there's also social movement mutual aid, which I think is the most commonly discussed, where it's informal or formal, and they tend to have a non-hierarchical and resistant to incorporation into the state. And it often comes out of people being distrustful of the state. I would think of Black Lives Matter when it began as being one of those types of social movement mutual aids. So the majority of our conversation today will be focused on the Ironbound Community Corporation. This is a many, many years long effort organized by people on the ground, but has grown to connect with corporations, with municipal bodies, with legal bodies. And the goal of this corporation is to offer services, broadly speaking, so thinking about children and families, thinking about environmental justice, as we talked about, thinking about housing justice, and in particular, Ironbound is home to a very large continental African and Latino immigrant population. And so ensuring that people who are immigrating here have smooth transitions is another very important goal to this mutual aid organization. So in the top, I think that's y'all's left? Right? We all seem confused, right? Okay. In the top corner, actually, I should say, there's an image of the Early Children's Developmental Center. And so it's a 100% free program for children between 0 and 5. And that's a landmark effort given the high number of young children who need services like that in the region. And then in the bottom corner, you'll see Riverfront Park, which is the only public free waterfront green space available to Newark residents, and it was opened in 2012, so it's not even old, it's a really young offering. And so it was prior to 2012, it was impossible for people who live in that area. If you remember, the Passaic River is running along the top half, and you had no access to that river, which is ludicrous. So when we talk about synchronicities, intentions, I'm just trying to consider what are the things that these two frameworks already have in common, and honestly, our conversations have been very illuminating in that regard. And so thinking about continuous learning and social change as differently expressed aspects of both frameworks has been really helpful, particularly given that mutual aid has a targeted and place-based form of engagement with people. And then they're also kind of both structured around a capacity for predicting change is something that I also wanted to focus on. I'll circle back. But something that I noticed in the strategic plan, and you'll see that each of these 4 options appear in the strategic plan, is the community-based needs were largely around ensuring that people who live in the area can continue to live there, they won't be priced out of the region, and then also a discussion about what I pointed out to in the beginning, environmental justice, how many children are dealing with asthma and all these other types of environmental conditions. And in particular, what they pointed us to, and what I hope to understand, is how to use the advancements in, say, property technology to think about how a program like Development Without Displacement could be streamlined. And we'll circle back to that at the end, but another aspect is intra-organizational. There is a lot of gaps in terms of what people can accomplish on the ground and the things that they need to do to serve the community. So in particular, they pointed out that there's a need for a relational database that tracks participants across programs, particularly if we are looking for how, say, somebody who's seeking services for childcare is also looking for services for ESL. So how can we ensure that those people can search up one thing and find all that information at once, or search up certain contacts and get in contact all at once. And then another intra-organizational need presented was thinking about cross-program knowledge and comprehensive orientation. In particular, many of the people who work within the ICC are volunteer workers or part-time workers, so ensuring that people who are part of the organization actually know what the org has to offer was important. And another thing to consider is if you're an expert on one topic, say in the Early Learning Center, you may not know about all the other things. So a parent might come in and say, pick up their kid and say, I've been having this issue, but they don't necessarily know, the person they're speaking to doesn't necessarily know where to point them to solve the issue. So another thing to consider. And I wanted to offer this example of UHelp, which was kind of like a prototype app created in Spain, where the premise of it was that people who need help can offer it, or need help can ask for it, and people who want to help can offer it. So I did download it, I took a look, and I think what is helpful in thinking about, especially talking about this relational database, is that it kind of removes the need to have a middleman or somebody who will say, I need this person to do this for me. So in the example I gave where somebody shows up to a child care facility and says, I'm picking up my kid, but I also have this need, then that middleman would have to go do that extra work, whereas they could just enter their information in or ask for help, and then find that help otherwise. So thinking tensions, I think some of these are tensions that arise using any technology. In particular, surveillance was a big issue discussed, needing to store and use personal data, especially for people who are maybe undocumented, people who are maybe experiencing homelessness, and then also thinking about access, broadly speaking. Obviously, something like this would require internet, and that's also come up in our discussions throughout. And then particular to this region, that there would be language barriers as well in terms of English literacy and digital. Another thing I want to circle back to thinking about tensions is, again, how to approach generating trust, especially for people who are maybe have faith in the organization, but might not necessarily have faith in a technology like this. So as I was looking into what has been done in the past, thinking about mutual aid and using AI, in particular, I think COVID-19 is a particularly prescient example where in response to the COVID-19 outbreak, there was a lot of on-the-ground organizing. In particular, it was interesting to see that people took up something called participatory mapping, where they would map resources on even something like Google Maps, or just sending messages to the people within their mutual aid network, saying there are masks here, there are these protective equipment here, so that people were able to stay in contact with one another without necessarily literally coming into contact with one another. And also creating trust based on the fact that there is a mutual support of one another, whether or not you know the person who is offering the help. What I thought was also particularly interesting is that it's like a high level record in real time, and for the people who are participating, they get an opportunity to also know who in their community has similar values to them. At the same time, it's a limited scope. So something like participatory mapping is still always going to be about who you know and how close you are to whoever it is you want to access, and can also be a little exclusive about what knowledge would be otherwise shared. And then, of course, reiterating what was on the last slide, reiterating what was on the last slide, using sensitive information and having to deal with sensitive situations is something that is usually better done interpersonally, where there's a sense of trust, even if it's unsure. Okay. So I want to again return to their strategic plan that was laid out a couple years ago. And their strategic plans tend to last for 10 years. So the main things I notice is the insistence that housing developments that happen in the iron-bound district include people who live there. And then also thinking about development broadly speaking, how to develop economically, et cetera. Another thing I wanted to consider is research practice partnerships and its uses in this context, and then also thinking about, again, the status of trust and how to continue connecting neighbors. So thinking about housing, I think one of the major issues is that was mentioned in the strategic plan is that it's difficult to stay alert or stay aware of upcoming housing possibilities. So it's something that they need someone dedicated to, but there's just not enough resources. So using something that could streamline that process, collect the information without necessarily needing that single person dedicated, paid or otherwise to do that, is one of the things that would help to kind of help ensure that people who are living in the area have access to this like huge economic growth. Another thing that I was considering is RPPs, and in another role that I was in, we spent a lot of time thinking about CS for all, but more for in a more metropolitan center. It was in Queens, and in particular, what I liked about the framework for CS for all as an RPP is that it requires academics to have RPPs are, for anybody, are partnerships between usually an academic and a community organization or a school district, whatever it is. And so toward a certain goal, and CS for All is particularly aimed at making sure that young people have access to computer science and understanding how to develop and computer engineer and all these other types of things. So in particular, what I liked about the framework is that the grant required these researchers to have a sustained commitment to the community that they wanted to do their research with. So it wasn't a proposal that you want to work with someone, it's that you've been working with someone and then you are going to extend that partnership through the grant. And so what I noticed about the strategic plan through the ICC is that they're already working with academics, with researchers, and that something like this grant would be helpful in thinking about relieving that burden of having to do research, of having to make those connections, of having to build maybe internal applications to support the work that they want to do. And so while there's, again, many initiatives that they already have, I think what is helpful about this framework is it kind of allows a way to deepen the things that they're already working on rather than looking for ways to replace the strategies or initiatives that they are focused on. So, returning to the question of trust, I offer these two quotes, one from Dan McQuillan, who writes extensively about mostly the perils of AI, but spend a little bit discussing about what mutual aid has to teach or correct in AI. So he writes, CARE acts as an epistemological corrective to AI because it directs attention to situated vulnerability and dependency. CARE is the opposite of algorithmic detachment and abstraction. So I found this offering really interesting because even as McQuillan offers CARE as opposite AI or opposite this idea of detachment and abstraction, it's still in relationship with this abstraction. And so for me, as I was thinking about how to consider the status of trust, I was really interested in how trust could be rewritten or inscribed differently. And so Octavia Butler's offering, "We'll have to be very careful how we allow our needs to shape us," kind of echoes this restraint where we're being asked to not just think about care as something that is still or is a vehicle for change, but care is also something that can be internally changed, can be rewritten for the context that it's being applied. And in particular, I was really taken by, I think Harry said yesterday about how it's always going to be a compromise. And I think similarly, the idea of a perfect care is always going to be failing. So if we're thinking about trust as something that can be perfect, even in the examples where we're having people organizing on the ground, the idea of trust is always imperfect. So I think if that's something that we lean into and we anticipate rather than fear and build restrictions around, then there's a way to think about the changes that something like the introduction of AI and a mutual aid framework could bring. And how cool is it that Octavia Butler predicts literally everything? So, looking forward, lingering questions. This is really riffing off of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who kind of asked, how do we ensure mutual aid reaches those we despise? So talked really briefly about how something like participatory mapping depends on who you know, and how do we ensure that, I don't know, the conservative down the street that you don't think well of, who isn't in your network, also has access to things, even if it's not somebody who ideologically you agree with. And then how can this idea of care, as we're reframing it, help to push along that question or help to kind of buoy that issue? And then next steps, definitely, I myself am still learning. I want to think more seriously about participatory research. And I'm also really interested in expanding this case study of the ICC, which is extremely well-established mutual aid type in this region, into the existing network. And I'll offer that there are many, 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 many mutual aid organizations in the region. There's the Newark Water Coalition. If you heard about Flint, Michigan, not having water that's clean, that's been a problem in Newark forever. Central Ward Community Fridge offers food to those in need. Brick City Mutual Aid is much like if you are on Instagram and someone posts their Cash App, it's similar to that. It's just collecting money so that it can be dispersed. And then, of course, ICC, as we've been speaking about broadly. So thank you. I want to thank the organizers, everybody here. Sorry to cut off the clapping. And also, I want to thank my mom, whose story helped prompt this research. So thank you.
Thanks, Ai. So our last speaker this morning is Sayak Roy, who is an urban cultural geographer pursuing a PhD in geography at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He has an MA in geography from the Delhi School of Economics at the University of Delhi and an MPhil degree in urban studies from the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. His research interest focuses on urban lived experiences, informality, and urban everyday and night geographies from the perspective of Southern urban theory and technological transition. Sayak's work have recently awarded by the Humanities Research Institute Inter-Seminar Fellowship at UIUC. Sayak.
Hello. So, okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon and talking about night. Yeah, so thank you so much, for giving me this opportunity. It's really incredible to be here. I've been listening since last week, all really incredibly intense talks. And I kind of remembering when Anirban first shared this call, I kind of, get attracted is for the early PhD scholar. It seems like I'm like in too early stage of my PhD. So let's see what can I bring. And also it's quite interesting that being an urbanist and feel as a minority in academic group, it's a real privilege. So thank you for that. I actually work on night. So my plan is here to kind of build confusion for the 10 minutes and clear a few confusion for the next 10 minutes. Let's start. So what happened? India, since last 2 decades, have been really growing, like India's information technology industries really started growing. And it is quite important to remember here that India's information technology industry is very much export-oriented in nature. As a result, a large chunk of India's information technology industrial function is kind of happening during the night time. So they can follow up with the daytime inversion of their sub-production unit, which is somewhere located in the cities of Global North, very specifically in Europe and North America. The interesting part, how I kind of get attracted, it's India's state or the government structure is kind of facilitating the growth of the information technology industry because they are getting a lot of revenue from it. But the same state is kind of truncated or restricted the nocturnal free activities. As a result, this night laborer are kind of lack with the basic infrastructure like transport, even the right to work break or right to unionize. And as a result, this India's night dynamics looks a bit messy because it's now 3 sectors. One is a private corporate entities. Also there is a state. Then there is a lot of informal practices started emerging to fill the gap of basic lack infrastructure. That's the work we will kind of talk about in this presentation. It's okay. So as I kind of talked about my PhD journey is new, but this work is kind of continuation of my MPhil work. And I kind of conceptually, started working on with a very interesting idea of a discontinuous citizenship, which a French geographer Louis Guensky is kind of gave. And Guensky kind of argues that like people from the marginal racial groups or the labor, their basic rights of citizenship is kind of started discontinuing as the evening proceed towards the night. So people from racial minority, marginal group, even the gender minority feel more vulnerable during the late night. And that's kind of work. This is me. I kind of did in MPhil, I kind of work with the night workers, like especially the cleaners, maintenance, as well as the people who are working in the IT industries or call centers. So India first kind of introduced, like the state is introduced its Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service Act in 2016 to kind of facilitate night infrastructure like the transport and other stuff. But this project is still kind of very much in the policy level. There is very lack implementation at the grassroots. And also in the post-pandemic time, the state is kind of saying they kind of want to recover the economic loss they went through during the time of COVID. And as a result, they also kind of greasing this idea of 24/7 urban operation. Then Prime Minister Modi's smart city ambition also have a very interesting round-the-clock production agenda. But I will in later kind of discuss how the smart city and the AI city have a different, some kind of different perspective in the case of nocturnal governance. And let's move, I already talked. So that's kind of, again, one interesting context. Like while the state is saying, like, do expand the call center or the IT business, the same state is not facilitating the infrastructure. It is not even allowing to open shops after 11 p.m. As a result, the night shift workers often, lack the very basic necessities during their work period. And to kind of fill that gap, there is a lot of informal practices started happening. So there is a lot of so-called illegal or informal tea stall owners who kind of, operate on the night street, but they bribe police. Sometimes they kind of introduce interesting tactics. So what they did, they kind of put their shutters of their shops is halfway down. And so when the police patrolling car arrived, they said, we are not doing the business. I'm just cleaning or restocking for the next business days. But they are actually kind of doing the business, using such strategies. So we'll talk, and this just, I made an ugly map of how the network production happened from India and is connected with the European and North American cities. And I kind of, to develop this map, I follow some business analysis report. This is a IMF like satellite image, how the nocturnal activities kind of increased, from 1992 to 2013. I do not have a satellite image for the 2024. It's look much more brighter now. Now this kind of conceptual framework of my paper. So Manuel Castells in his work of Information City is talked about how the network is kind of operate in this framework of transnational and technological global assemblages. But Manuel Castells' idea is talking about how these IT giants or even the macro structure, the state, have certain kind of capacity to manipulate such networks. But my point here is that how the people at the grassroots or the community, the night shift workers, they are kind of reading the practice at the macro scale, like at the level of the grassroots. I'll not go much here because the intercluster is very different for urbanists and no one is from urbanism. But the one thing I just keep want to emphasizing about the concept that I'm kind of propagating here, the idea of inhabiting AI. So there is a growing literature in the field of urban studies about the inhabitation. So it's when the state is not providing the basic infrastructure of housing, of water, of electricity, or any basic facility, people are kind of find their way to manage it. Last weekend we visited Soweto and we see how they are kind of managing their electricity and infrastructure. So very similarly, I'm kind of propagating that idea, how the community at the grassroots level inhabiting this AI and kind of repurposing it for their own benefits. So there's just one important aspect before we go into the actual 3 stories I just want to share, that the night itself as a political project have a very different connotations, because people always kind of consider night as very uncontrolled. It's very ungovernable. As a result, there's a history of a lot of insurgent groups, even like people do secret meetings during the night time. However, with the introduction of the smart city, what happened, there is a huge rollout of the CCTV and sensors. And that, so night is kind of losing its charm, and as a result, the data is continuously, gathered. Even a small group is gathered at night to do a kind of secret meeting or anything. There is a continuously data gathering is kind of collection is happening. But what is the more problem that, as the urbanism started shifting from the smart city to a AI city, is that smart city is actually unable to make the decisions. It can only collect data and, process that data and kind of transfer that data to an urban planner or the people who are doing the urban governance. But AI city, as a city brain, can actually make a decision. So AI city is basically replacing the role of an urban planner. So that's a kind of a challenge. I will kind of talk through the next 3 stories. So I'll talk very distinct 3 stories. The first story is about the food delivery riders, like the Uber Eats. In India, there is the other 2 Indian version, which is the Zomato and Swiggy. So the first story about the food delivery workers who kind of work, especially at the night time. And the second one is about the lighting of night. And third one is about certain kind of, India's landscape is very much gendered in nature, so how the women night shift workers find a different app. So that's kind of my 3 stories. So the first story here is about how the delivery riders is kind of, procuring like the food, or how the food delivery work during the night time. So while doing the ethnographic work, I kind of interviewed a lot of, food delivery riders. So especially from the Zomato and Swiggy, I didn't honestly talk, well, the Uber Eats also operated in India, but my interviewers are not from that company. So they said, like, there is a certain kind of challenges to doing the food delivery at night. So one of them they said about the road safety and visibility. Sometimes the police harassment is also very much there. So I asked, like, how do you operate? They said, like, if we based our, we do our business based on the applications, then it's very difficult to run the livelihoods. Then I said, what is the trick? They said, as of now, what we are doing when we kind of operate in a 5 or 10 kilometers radius for over 3 months, then we know like who are our customers. It's mostly the night shift workers. And when we do a business in a particular area for 3 months, we kind of established a network, a communication. As a result, they send the order on WhatsApp, and we took the order from restaurant and delivered directly to the customer. So they said that's how we are bypassing the app. There is also some kind of interesting aspect that I actually didn't expect. There is a multiple app usage, so one delivery rider using the Zomato, Swiggy, and Uber simultaneously. But sometimes what happened, they received the orders in the two applications. So how they manage, they said we have a WhatsApp network for a 5-10 kilometer radius, and we constantly shared our live location for 8 hours. So you quickly find out the nearest rider and kind of exchange the items. So which is also, I found, a kind of very interesting practice to kind of, they talked about how they're surviving. But how much this looks very romantic, very revolutionary. Some of my riders also said they kind of lose their app, because whenever the application figure out that they are transgressing, they actually block the account, and they need to go to union. It's a huge process. Now, the second story. This story is actually, doing the ethnographic work. So, like in 2018, as an MPhil scholar, while doing the field work, I used to kind of roam for 6-7 months, like during the night time. So, I also figured out an interesting practice how the homeless sleepers is kind of, use the smart bus stop and as a temporary night shelter. So, and when I talk to the, homeless community, like who are kind of using this bus stop, they said they actually, first kind of observe for a few months, like when the technology operated light goes off at 11:55, then they used to come and occupy this smart bus stop, and they said this kind of, protect them from the rain, winter, or many other problem, and then they sleep there until the fast bus arrive in the morning. But then again, this brief time when I again return to the field and try to have a conversation with them, they are saying like, Yeah, we used to do that, but now the things started changing because the local urban bodies kind of observe that there is, people are using it for sleeping. They started replacing the clocked light with a motion sensor light. As a result, when they're trying to sleep or any body movement happen, then, the light just, keep turning on, and it's also kind of create a lot of surveillance. So that's a new challenge they're facing. So, I mean, my point is, again, the tricks or informal tactics they are deploying at this moment is not a fixed, it's not a counter design. It needs it needs to be evolved always. The third story, I mean, you all know, India's urban night is inherently patriarchal and marginalizing. There is a huge, ample stories of brutally gang raped, and the sexual harassment is happening in India's night now. The solution the Indian patriarchal societies come with is to lock women. They said women shouldn't go out after 7 p.m. But there is a contradiction. This neoliberal business and call centers, they kind of believe that, it's get a woman voice can sell the product, much easily. So there is a lot of night shift worker. Also a lot of feminist social movements happen in India, like the Break the Cage, which is like the Hindi name is the Pinjra Tod. And then Why Loiter is a Shilpa Farke kind of propagate that idea. But there is I talk to a lot of night shift laborers, especially from the IT and the call industry, work in the night, but do not have kind of know how to operate. So there is a new apps came with the name of My Safety Pin. So My Safety Pin is kind of launched in 2013. It's a personal safety app, and it's totally built on the crowdsourced data. So, a person, for example, in going for work in the night, they always do a safety score edits. And how they did that, it's kind of answering very basic questions like the lighting, visibility, people density, gender diversity, and overall feeling of safety. And from the GPS tracking, it gives a idea which place during the night is really safe. As I said, this application collect data through user inputs, GPS tracking, and some partnership with the local authorities and organization. So I kind of see it's very innovative approach to addressing the safety concerns in cities. Also very interestingly, these apps can provide you the detour routing. So for example, a person or night shift worker kind of thinking to go from point A to point B, and they think that's a small distance, but the Safety Pin app can, from the GPS location and the crowdsourced data, they said, at this moment, the crowd density is less here, why don't you follow a detour and to go from point A to point B. This just app data, I mean, it's an application interface. I have a small video. Do you have a time to play that? Okay. Can you play? Yeah, just a click, yeah.
Safety Pin is a technology platform and a set of apps to make public spaces safer and more inclusive. This is done by collecting and disseminating safety-related information on a large scale through crowdsourcing and other methods. Based on assessment of parameters related to physical infrastructure and social environment, a safety score is given for places. The data is shared with users and a wide range of urban stakeholders, including governments. My Safety Pin is a free app available on both the Play Store and App Store. As a user, you can share safety-related data as well as view and use all the data in the app. The app has many features that can help you to make safer decisions for your mobility. Safety audit. A safety audit can be done in under 1 minute like this. You have to rate each of the 9 parameters, and you also have the option to add an image and comment. Safest route. You can see both options for a route based on its safety by entering a destination in the search bar. The My Safety Pin app has over 120,000 downloads and is available in 5 different languages. Users are spread across 60 cities, and Safety Pin has worked on over 15 government projects.
Yeah. So that's their idea, and I kind of talk about the detour routing. The only interesting part, I didn't interview actually the software developer, but I just read in some secondary sources that they are kind of considering the AI integration, like increase the effectiveness of the real-time alerts, because especially in India context, the crowd is also kind of invoke a certain sense of security or safety. So if they can get a real-time reading of the crowd density, that will be, I think, really helpful for its effectiveness. It's another video I'm skipping. Oh, sorry. The last point, when I actually I try to talk to people about this project of the night geography, there is a kind of perception is like, more policing, more deployment of the police forces can solve many problems. Even a lot of this technology also believe, okay, night feels unsafe, let's bring more AI city brains and roll out the idea of the predictive policing. But policing, it's also kind of create different kind of marginality, especially this night shift workers, the night shift labor community I am kind of talking about here. They're marginalized in a lot of intersectional level. Some of them are migrants, some of them don't have valid work permits, a lot of informal practices is happening here, which under the perspective of law may be straightway considered illegal. So that's actually kind of, like a challenge, like, how much space we should give to police or not. Like, from the experience of my ethnographic work, I think policing is not the solution here. This is kind of my, that's a future research provocation, and I think I missed this point completely. It's fine that a lot of informal practices, a lot of community practices is kind of happening in the street. But I'm kind of very interested, how do the engineers, the software developers, or the creators, view or approach this project of navigating or inhabiting AI? Like, how they're seeing this kind of circumvent or navigating tactics. So, and if we can build a certain kind of, connection between the informal practice and this tech workers, I think it will be kind of beneficial for a more just nightlife. So with that, thank you so much.
So what I really liked about all three of these papers is the richly textured engagement that they had with community goals. And that's something that I think I'd like to bring out in my comments and hear more about from all of the speakers today. So Charlotte started by showing the different ways of reading ChatGPT output. And jailbreaking is, of course, a dramatic example of the kind of contested relationship between the practices of corporations that distribute AI chatbots and the authors. And, sort of, it's natural to read those kinds of sort of fictional prompts as through these kinds of creative practices that Charlotte was talking about. I just wanted to add a couple other kinds of reading practices into the mix, and Charlotte, hear what you have to say about them. One is, of course, the use of ChatGPT to cheat in producing text that the users of the system can claim as their own. And I think this is another interesting case of authorial intention in that the users here are endorsing and appropriating the text from the system. Another thing that's sort of perhaps worth adding into the mix is the use of Google's Gemini to present web kind of summary texts, where I think it's clear that the Google and the other institutions providing the text are really committed to it in ways that maybe the Stochastic Parrots paper sort of under-theorizes. All of these call for different kind of practices of reading and writing on the part of users in the system. And it'd be interesting to see how much of kind of the authors, the sort of, how much the systems can be held accountable for the text, but also how much, in many ways, the users of the system can be accountable for the text in these kinds of cases. What I really thought was provocative about your work is this emphasis on trust, and the sense that I got from the analyses that you did that so much of the work of these mutual aid societies involves creating relationships among the people that need services and the people that are prepared to provide them. And what I thought was, sort of a great opportunity, I would say, for Design Justice AI in the kind of landscape that you presented was the idea that a kind of management transactional, kind of techno-solutionist type of AI infrastructure would just be about, sort of streamlining the management of these organizations, whereas a more kind of community-centered, kind of human-focused intervention could potentially try to use AI to strengthen the relationships among community members. And I'd be curious to think about and hear more about what kinds of technological interventions could potentially build stronger relationships between sort of providers and sort of new immigrants or new parents or these other kinds of people that are particularly vulnerable. I just thinking for myself, there's a lot of obstacles around sort of pride and being uncomfortable reaching out that sort of pushing yourself anonymously into an app are maybe only going to accentuate. So, just sort of thinking about what design justice can do, I'd like to hear more about that. And then what I thought was great about Sayak's presentation is the sense of that night policy is really contested. And of course, this is something that you see in Western cities as well, where, sort of, what like nightlife means in even New York City is, sort of problematic as a sort of work, entertainment, safety, and all the rest. And so what I thought was particularly challenging about this kind of environment is the extent to which sort of the illegality and the kind of state policy sort of limits the technological solutions that are possible, in that sort of big tech project inherently kind of institutionalizes the solution that it offers. And so, the kind of way that these informal networks kind of work around some of the maybe short-sighted or unrealistic kind of top-down policies, can't be replicated technologically, because to sort of put in code the way that we're not following the law is to, just sort of put the developers, on the hook for, solutions that the government can just come in and shut down or whatever. Yeah, so, well, I'm curious, so like, what that suggests is that like sort of the tech is going to be inseparable from the policy. I'm curious like sort of what the technological and political landscape is like for sort of coming to a kind of collective solution that responds to people's needs and the way that they want to use the city, even if that means sort of changing what the government thinks the city is for. Maybe we can hear from each of the speakers in turn, and then what we'll do again is collect a collection of questions, sort of one from each speaker, as we can sort of move through. Since we don't have quite as much time for discussion as we've had in some of the other sessions, I'd like to be sure that we get a good mix of stuff from the floor. Charlotte. We can't hear you. Are you muted?
Yes, thank you so much. I needed to be allowed to unmute myself. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for those comments, Matthew. I appreciate it. And thanks to the other speakers. I found both of those talks really fascinating. I'm thinking in particular about your question about cheating and people passing off ChatGPT's outputs as their own. And it made me think about a couple of things. One is to say, I think part of why I rehearsed that kind of history of literary theory was to kind of get to show the way that the delineation between reading and writing as maybe passive and active processes has kind of broken, ideas about that has kind of broken down. And I think that with ChatGPT and with the act of, prompting it and it producing something and that becoming a kind of a two-way dance, that blur between reading and writing becomes very apparent. And I think that it maintains that blurry nature so long as it remains in the interface. And then once it is taken out of that interface and submitted as an assignment, it somehow it changes in its nature. So I guess that really just got me to thinking about really how significant the interface design is to encouraging or to allowing a kind of theatrical understanding of what's taking place. I mean, one of the really interesting things has been thinking about the nature of the screen, like, because I'm working with these screenshots, right? And thinking about the nature of the screenshot as being halfway between like a digital image that has been made and a photograph. And it kind of straddles that place. And people really share this, like, screenshots themselves become memes that get shared on Twitter, again and again. And prompts also, in the way that jailbreak prompts become memes that get shared again and again, and this way become kind of, in a way, like scripts, play text that get shared amongst users, but that can only be performed on the stage of the ChatGPT application, if you like. And once they take it off, they change in nature somehow. They stop being a live performance. And how we define live we could say, well, it's an ontological thing, like either it's live, it's alive, or it's not. But we can also say, no, it's a framing device that kind of changes the way that people think about what it is they're interacting with. That's to go off on another tangent again. But those are just some of the thoughts that I had in response to your question. Thank you, Matthew.
Can y'all hear me? Cool. Yeah, I really appreciated that question about what kinds of technological interventions could build stronger relationships. I think in part it's really circumstantial. So in the example of the COVID-19 response, people were able to organize without a leader, without someone, like there was no middle person. So using things like Slack or like any kind of open forum to do that. So I think in that bit of the literature, it was possible to think about technology playing an integral part of connecting people who wouldn't otherwise have any reason to talk to one another. And I think what they found is that the people who took advantage of that resource met people and form relationships that would not otherwise exist. So your next door neighbor, for instance, that you don't really speak to, they were able to find and connect with those people. I think another thing that question made me think about was what would be the disaster response possibility maybe in Newark, in that area. And I know that because it's bordered by the river and in general poor sewer systems, something like a 10-minute heavy rainfall causes the river to overflow and the sewage to back up into the street. So something like having the ability to connect with people, or even like if there are a lot of people posting on social media, whether in English or another language, having some kind of resource where they can pull together all the types of things that people are asking for or drawing attention to in a certain region, and then be able to respond to that. I think that's one of the challenges that comes up in the strategic plan, that people are more likely to share, say, a post on Facebook versus reaching out to their particular organization. So how can we respond to people in a timely way, and also anticipate the need before it happens?
Thank you. Okay. Is that working? Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you, Matthew, for your comments, like two of your comments. The first thing is, yes, it is. We have to accept that the most of our social theory, the understanding of social practice, is very much built on the lived experience of the daytime. So that's a gap, but there is a lot of geographers, sociologists, planners. It's a growing discipline, so a lot of people are kind of working in the night studies. The second question is about the distinction between the legality and the illegality, which is kind of create a lot of complications. In my perspective at this moment, especially in Indian context, I think the state need to take an active participation in designing the night market. State need to facilitate it. At this moment, in India's nocturnal context, the state is kind of presence through its absence. As a result, these informal things are kind of new tactical practices emerging. But I'm kind of scared, and I'm kind of seeing that the big entrepreneurial market or the capitalistic ventures, they slowly try to appropriate those gaps. So what happens if the cab companies are considered illegal, then some entrepreneur find a gap in the laws and launch a new cab company charging huge amount. Then some entrepreneur find a gap in law and open a night market. So, they will keep kind of appropriating. That's what they want. So the only solution in my mind is kind of state need to intervene. Also, I kind of believe, the practice, the three stories I kind of talking about, because, these people exist even without my research, even without any design justice lab, they will keep doing that. But I kind of, that's a thing also I write in my application, that Arturo Escobar idea of autonomous design is kind of, I'm not fully persuaded by that, because this counter practice they are actually doing, if we try to make kind of a consolidated counter design, it will be a problem. If this practice maybe always exists like that, like, maybe after 1 year they have a different manifestation, but they will exist. But I'm not sure if we can really make a counter design, from this grassroots practice. That's my perception.
Lauren, and then Favre.
I think Favre should go first.
This question is for Charlotte. So I have this quote here from an Ifa audio that is, "We know that this temple we built for Orishanla is rather small, considering his dignity, but we implore him to accept it so. But if Orishanla, that's a Yoruba deity, should think it beneath his dignity to accept the temple so, let him himself, cutlass in hand, at height of noon, go to the hostile forest. Let him cut wood for rafters, let him make rope for binders, let him bareheaded carry them home. Then indeed he would appreciate the hardships and difficulties his devotees endure to render him due worship." And then there is this Igbo proverb that says, "If the oracle demands too much, the Igbo man will show him the tree it was carved from." And if the oracle fails to be potent, if its worshippers will call it by the name of the tree it's carved from and use it as firewood. And when during your presentation you talked about various ways through which I suppose we could read how people interact with ChatGPT, and I wondered if while you spoke, something that occurred to me when you also talked about joyous and jubilant responses was also irreverence. So I feel that I suppose I myself, when I think about relationships between devotees of a particular religions and their the deities they worship, that it's often something slavish. But I think that from some of these texts, we can see that even the worshippers themselves realize that possess some sort of resistance, even in their worship and to the deity they worship. And I wondered if this was something itself that you thought of well, I'm not going to talk about justice and vengeance on the idol itself. And then I also saw yesterday on Twitter, there was these robot dogs that, well, when you see, I used to think of them in the past as companies trying to make us love surveillance by, presenting cameras as dogs so that we can love them and be affectionate towards them. But I saw people pushing it had 2 legs. People were pushing it, trying to trip it, and it just looked like bullying. And then I guess my second question, the other thing I was wondering is that, do you think another reading we can extract from this is, I don't know, the usage of AI as a mirror? Like, what sort of person tries to trip a dog to prove something? Like, what are you trying to prove exactly? And when you go to a chatbot and you try to trigger it to make racist comments, what exactly are you trying to prove? I don't know. I mean, and then when you come out to display those screenshots, like, I wonder that don't these people see what it makes them look like? I feel like sometimes people do it in order to show that, oh, ChatGPT is so bad, look at what it generated. But why did you go to ask it to generate those things in the first instance? I wondered what you thought about those two. AI as, I don't know, a sort of mirror, and the irreverence of users as, I don't know, acknowledgement of the autocraticness of the systems themselves. And yes.
Can you hear me? I'm really glad that Favre agreed to go first because I knew that she would ask a really hard question and make mine seem easy. What I love about the panel is the thread of care, which I think it really brings us all together. And I wish I had a question that was a little bit less focused on Charlotte's paper and more toward the panel, but I fear that if I reformulate that I'll just become abstruse, and that's never a good idea. So, Charlotte actually reached out to see if she could hear my paper, which, as she knows, is on somewhat similar terrain, and there simply was no way to do that. So this is a down payment on a continuing conversation that I really, really look forward to. I so much enjoyed your paper, and I think you're totally right about how, Sedgwick gives us something that we can do in a so-called post-critical vein, but it's really just, it's a promise without a concrete example of where we can go. In terms of the engagement with the very important papers, both of which have Emily Bender as the lead author, Stochastic Parrots, but also the Bender and Kohler paper, which you can't really understand Stochastic Parrots without reading it. And this is one of the issues that makes it challenging for those of us in literary studies in particular, but also the humanities more generally, to engage these papers. They're not written in a style that is anything like how we work, and they routinely cite things that they expect readers to simply know. And if we don't read those citations, if we're not familiar with, say, Herbert Clark's using language, to name one important instance, we're simply not going to know what they're actually saying on these topics of really communication in language. So one thing that I've come to a sort of provisional conclusion about is that the Stochastic Parrots paper under-theorizes writing as distinct from communication in real time, which is what, by the way, Herbert Clark is talking about. And that's where they derive most of their theories. Once you recognize that, it becomes legible that literary critics completely under-theorize talking, except, conversation is not part of what we do because we write about literature. Every single thing that you put on your wonderful slide had the word text in it. So, we don't think about that. They don't think about textualization much. And so we're actually talking about two different objects. And I actually think that when you take a look at those other contexts, that it's not quite the case that they are conceiving anything like a monadic, autonomous subject. If anything, the subject that they conceive, they don't use the word subject, is intersubjective, which is certainly true for Clark, from which they get most of their theory. So I just, I kind of think, especially since very quickly these systems are moving toward having voice activation, we may actually be the last generation that experiences them as textual producing, as distinct from producing the appearance of spoken language. And that the under-theorization of writing might become less of a problem outside of writing classrooms, where the question really becomes what I think Matthew was pointing towards, which is, can we teach people to be good prompters alone as a method of teaching them to communicate in language? You know, how will people who, if there is such a generation, have only learned to communicate through prompting text generators, and I don't know that this will ever happen, but how will their spoken language change? So I kind of think that we have an open set of questions that we want to engage, hopefully through design justice principles, and that we would gain something strong from looking at those papers on their own terms, in a spirit that acknowledges some of the things they get right. Even though I mean, I never use the word stochastic parrot. I call them probabilistic mimics because, you know, I think parrots are totally cool.
So Charlotte, why don't you take a moment to answer those, and maybe we can hear from I and Sayak after that on the themes of care and how that might resonate in light of the discussion so far.
Sure. Thank you so much for both of those comments and questions. Favor, I feel like we might be kindred spirits. I think that you are the queen of irreverence in this context, given the discussion of vagina cakes during your presentation, which I've been retelling to everyone that I run into. I'm really interested in this question of people treating ChatGPT, for example, as a mirror. When I first started my research, I was really stuck on the concept of mimesis and the idea of how, like, AI from its beginning in the 50s has been thought about in relation to the idea of imitation, which is one way of thinking about mimesis, but mimesis has been re-theorized again and again as mediating kind of between some world which is presumed to come first and some secondary world that comes after, and that by through the negotiating those two worlds, we learn something about the former. And I feel like there is something, and mimesis as well is closely related to discussions about spiritual questions and relationships with entities that aren't existing on the same plane. So all of which is to say, like, I feel there is something in there that relates to what you're gesturing at. In terms of, yeah, I really, sometimes I see people saying like, I tricked ChatGPT into giving me a recipe for Molotov cocktails. And I think, why do you search Wikipedia if you want a recipe for Molotov cocktails? Like, come on, this is crazy, right? What is it that you're trying to prove here? And I think what we can trace is that what started as an idea of like, let's do this jailbreaking, which started with a set of machine learning engineers kind of showing off on Twitter, then gets picked up by a group who is more interested in talking about political bias vis-a-vis, you know, Biden versus Trump or whatever. And then they kind of appropriate that idea of jailbreaking and move it into a completely different context. And suddenly, like you say, it becomes it becomes this performance of, they're not actually, so when, and this is why I think the theatricality is a useful kind of analogy for thinking about it, is because when that user goes into ChatGPT and says, can you write a poem praising Donald Trump? They do it in the full expectation that ChatGPT will say, no, I cannot write a poem praising Donald Trump. And the whole purpose is to screenshot that and share it amongst its community. So it actually becomes a performance of irreligiosity or whatever, like, do you know what I mean, of disrespect, right? So I think that that's interesting, the way that way of interacting has been picked up from one context and played out in a different one. And I'm keeping this as short as I can, even though I'm really excited by the ideas and the prompts, so thank you. Lauren, I really would appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this more. I really agree with what you're saying about, you know, Herbert Clark and the deeper context of the paper. Actually, Bender is also the co-author on this textbook called like Linguistics 101 for Computer Scientists that I've waded through as best I can to try and unpack exactly what it is that she and her co-authors are getting at. And I agree with the comment about under-theorizing writing. I mean, one thing that just strikes me as really interesting in the Stochastics Parrot paper is that they include a quote from Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts. And as the queer mother of 2 young children, that's a really important book to me. I mean, that is a book that is made up of quotes. it is, you know, it is a permutation of texts. And so it is an odd choice to use in the context of an assertion about kind of the uniqueness or the kind of the absolute creativity of human expression, I guess, which is not to undermine their point, except to say that there's a lot of kind of, do you know what I mean, jostling taking place. And I guess, I think, and this is my last comment, I think that this is why the theatrical, you know, I said, oh, I'm interested in theatricality, and then I spent my whole time talking about literary theory. In a sense, that's because that's where the field is at the moment. But I actually think theatricality might be the better frame, right? Because the theatre depends upon a distributed performance, and the theatre is a place where the line between text and speech is blurred all the time. So all of which is just to say yes and, I think. So thank you.
I guess I've got a question on care, to maybe like pull it all together. Yeah, so I just continue from Lauren's thread. Yeah, I'd love to hear how you kind of reflect on care, and I suppose, you know, scholars of care also like draw attention to the way that care itself is political, right? It's not a neutral concept. It's not like inherently benevolent, but it can be co-opted for political ends, and often to, you know, reinforce this matrix of domination that we're talking about, rather than, you know, dismantling it as it aims to do. So I guess, you know, in each of your contexts about like reparation and about care and safety as well, in terms of absence and stuff, how might this like non-normative nature of care kind of figure into your context?
Yeah, I was curious about with the pen, what's the app? A safety pen. Yeah, safety pen. If there are like unintended consequences of like stigmatization within neighborhoods, and does it create, since I don't understand the landscape, are there like these neighborhoods, and are there ethnic divisions within these neighborhoods, and can they be gamed to create stigmatization against other, say, rival ethnicities or things like, if that occurs?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, there is possibility. There is very much possibility, although in the safety score audits, they are kind of taking the 9 parameters, which is mostly focused on the light visibility, crowd, and any sexual harassment happened before, you know, on that place. But definitely, you know, that problem will be very still embedded. You know, it can lead to certain kind of stigmatization, you know, towards the marginalized community. And I'm more scared if, you know, as of now, it's a non-profitable app. If in future it got deplatformed and like, you know, kind of appropriated by some other, then it will become more risky.
So do any of you kind of respond to Will's question?
Could I get that question one more time from Will?
I'm just thinking about like how care itself is political, right? And so care can kind of serve political ends that reinforce power rather than dismantling it. I don't know if that kind of figures into your case at all.
Yeah. I think that is an interesting question. I think in part, it's almost like it's really difficult to escape what you're talking about. Like it seems like most, if not all, relationships are kind of imbricated through power. So I wonder, to the question of care in the, or maybe rethinking care in the mutual aid context, it might be important to, I mean, tread carefully, but also important to consider how, maybe echoing Harry again, how fit to purpose a certain offered care is. Because I think sometimes what is offered in the, under the like carriage of care comes across, or is not necessarily like fit to the needs of who's being offered that, which is a difficult dance anyway. I think sometimes the correction has to be done retroactively anyway.
How about the...
You can go.
To Will's question about the care.
Yeah.
I mean, in my research context, I mean, the one point is kind of emphasizing, you know, like till now, urban planners kind of play the role, a negotiator between a state and the urban residents. And how much you critique the urban planner, I know many instances, you know, they kind of repurpose or help the urban residents to thrive. But the problem is happening, AI and the city brains is kind of try to replace the layer of the urban planner. As a result, you know, the idea of care is really kind of vanished from the whole dynamics because urban planner is losing their agency. And in terms of my own research, I'm kind of thinking to doing the while ethnographic work, if I can produce at least a podcast series with the night shift workers while maintaining their anonymity. Also kind of thinking like, you know, make a small film, but the film is always take a back shot. So the, you know, the anonymity will maintain, but you know, the stories can be shared. So yeah, that's a two kind of thing.
Okay, so our last two questions will be Alia and Fumi.
Hi, thank you all so much for your presentations. I feel like I'm gonna follow up with all of you. I had a question about mutual aid and using AI. In my own mutual aid group in Brooklyn, we often face this dilemma when we use technology like relational databases or, I don't know, web development, data analysis, whatever, not even AI, where the more you use sophisticated technology, even if it's fit for the need, the smaller the number of people that are able to actually interact with it, and therefore a smaller and smaller number of volunteers are actually able to handle these requests, and then you can accidentally create this like power dynamic, right, where like only a few people are able to handle certain issues or support in certain ways. So scaling that up to AI, I'm wondering how you would think about, yeah, sophisticated technologies like, and I know it's not as sophisticated as we like to claim it is, but technologies that may seem sophisticated in mutual aid contexts and the kind of power dynamics it could create with regards to technical background.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. I want to ask about guerrilla AI practices. We have talked a lot about how the government themselves, you'll find that they are the seat of capitalism. Like, we don't talk about capitalism as separate from the government because that is where all the lobbying happens. For instance, when you showed the My Safety Pin ad, PSA, I don't know what it's called. When you showed that video, one thing they mentioned is that, oh, the data will be sent to the government. And it's particularly said it in that video. So if data about safety is sent to the government, that still definitely adds to surveillance capitalism. And even for the iron-bound community that I mentioned, I Googled iron-bound in network, and although it's literally like called a little Portugal town now, This, that's what, not me, that's what is said online. We could find that there's a lot of racial dynamic going on because it started with Irish and German communities. Then went Portugal, then there are some African Americans. So, and you know how difficult trust is to build in a racially charged community. So with all of these dynamics, we find then that there are hidden communities within communities, such that the community is just not one holistic, monolithic group, but they are like all of these communities within these communities. For Sayak is communities of illegality, communities that they cannot stand under the sun, no matter how hard they try. So how then can we use guerrilla AI practices in providing care and mutual aid for these hidden communities within the communities? And what is the ethics of it? Like, yeah, that's my question.
Thank you, Fumi. You know, I really like the term guerrilla AI, so it's quite interesting. Yes, like, you know, my safety pin app is sharing the data. So, you know, that's remain the black box. At least, you know, while I kind of reading their policy documents and couple of interviews I kind of watched, it looks like it's still a non-profitable in like, it's really don't want to, they don't have a plan to launch a subscription plan. So that's like at that level, but yeah, definitely they're sharing the data with the government agencies, and they are saying, like, you know, like if we share kind of data with the nearest police station, then they believe their app and their implication will be more effective. So that's kind of their point, but I totally agree with you on that. And also about the community point you very rightly, you know, talked about, I don't think, you know, this, in my case, especially in my context, it is not a very closed community. So it's rather a network of people. So like, you know, maybe for a month there is a community, then a new people join, the community dynamics got changed. So it's more of a like people network, you know, like when the actors is coming and leaving the network group, so rather than a community. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, to Fumi's question first, I'm glad you asked that. I feel like I could talk about that for hours, but I won't force anybody to hear that. But I think like something that's interesting about that region is a lot of like the way that it's described right there is a very recent development. And so like, a place like Ironbound is in the process, not only of a lot of these different communities you describe coming to touch one another more intimately just because of a lot of displacement and a lot of restructuring, but also you have a large influx of upper class workers moving into the area, which is historically different from who has tended to live there. So I say that to say it's a complicated question when you're, I think you asked about ethics, right?
Yeah, I asked about ethics in relation to guerrilla, or guerrillas in Guerrilla, yeah. So like controversial AI practices in the way that we know that we cannot go through the government, so we have to come up with this other that are prone to resistance and resilience and all that kind of the politics of activism in AI practices, and then in relation to ethics, the ethics of that. So if I'm not going to go through the government or go through some very clean slate route, but I'm going to form like an app that does something that is very politically attuned, but not in relation to the government, then what is the ethics of that? And is that something that is allowed for catering for these hidden communities within communities?
Okay. So yeah, I think definitely different than what I thought you were asking, but I will just combine the two questions you asked for the sake of time. But I think I would actually be really curious to hear what your mutual aid community does in response to the things that you raise. But I think it's in part like in part difficult to create like a neat ethics like you're suggesting. I think it's really a challenge to not exacerbate these really like fragile relationships that already exist, like exacerbate the power dynamics that already are exist even within a single community, which is like anyway, very open-ended term. So I think part of what I'm interested in is not necessarily offering AI in this context as a Band-Aid or anything like that, but I do wonder what, given that there's already organizing happening, what it could offer. And I think at the same time, being as hesitant as you guys are all suggesting to what it could exacerbate. I think Will asked earlier about care and how it's political and not necessarily always a positive outcome. I think all those things are part of that process, but I don't think that there's a formula or a way to approach it that is fixed, even if it is regionally based. I think like answers to the question of ethics comes up when the moment demands it, if that makes sense. Kind of going with what Charlotte brought up briefly, Donna Haraway's thing with the trouble. I think that that's kind of her insistence that there's no formula to go about how to devise dashful solutions.
Thanks. So let's thank all three speakers one last time. And we'll be sitting with the troubles for the rest of the week.